Hello everybody, welcome to your lesson on the Canadian Charter as it relates to your ICCRC exam. So for all of you, I am absolutely positive that you studied the Canadian Charter thoroughly when you took your diploma program. And what we're going to do is just link that with the ICCRC exam and give you a small review. So when we take a look at the history of Canada, well, obviously a very quick look in this context, what we're really focusing on, of course, is how Canadian law came to be. So you can see these flags on the left here. And what we're doing is just taking a very brief look at the transition of Canada from being an English or British territory into, of course, an independent country. And this is all reflected, of course, in Canadian laws and what formed those Canadian laws. When we look down the line, we could see this, of course, reflected in immigration law as well. So we have the British North American Act of 1867, which formed the Dominion of Canada. Now, at that point, the British government system was in control, of course. The highest court in Canada was the British Privy Council. And the country itself, as an independent country, very generally speaking, it had little control over its own foreign affairs, and of course, domestic affairs were limited as well. Okay, so as we transition on, Canada got some more control, I guess, over its foreign affairs through the British Statute of Westminster of 1931. And finally, Canada got its own Supreme Court. So when a country gets a Supreme Court, and I'm sure that you know the role of Canada's Supreme Court in interpreting laws, in, of course, standardizing laws, standardizing the interpretations of laws, well, it's a very important deal and certainly leads to a lot of autonomy. Well, the big one is from 1982, so it's the Constitution Act. Now, I'm sure that you've seen the famous picture of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, with the Queen signing this Constitution Act. And some of the links I provided for you have a lot more history of this. This is a very interesting piece of Canadian history. So due to this act, the Constitution Act, Canada had complete independence from Britain. And of course, we have the Charter of Rights that was implemented. So there's a great quote that I really like from the Canadian Encyclopedia that is over here on the right. So it says, the Constitution Act 1982 was a landmark in Canadian history. It enshrined the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution, the highest law of the land, and completed the unfinished business of Canadian independence, allowing Canadians to amend their own constitution without requiring approval from Britain. So you can see that it might seem like it wasn't that long ago, but Canada was, of course, very tied to Britain before. So an important lesson here is, as we keep digging into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is to remember that it is part of the Constitution. All right, so as we keep digging into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like I said, I'm positive you read about this very thoroughly in your Immigration Practitioner Diploma program. But we've gone and summarized this quite a bit for you here. So we have freedoms and rights. Now, what is the difference between a Canadian Charter right and a Canadian Charter freedom? Well, a right is well, you can see the definition over here. A right is a legal, moral, or social expectation that Canadians are entitled to from the government. And then the difference between that and freedom is that a freedom is the right to live your life without interference from the government unless you impinge on the freedoms of others. So people have the right to ensure that their charter rights, of course, are being upheld through government support. And of course, if a person wants to practice, let's say, a certain religion or something like that, or has a certain belief, well, as long as the person is not impinging on the freedoms of others, the government does not have the right to impose in this person's beliefs or life, I guess, in that context. So when we take a look a little bit deeper into fundamental freedoms, we have what you would expect, right? So the freedom of religion, the freedom of belief, association, peaceful assembly, etc., etc., etc. So we've talked about this in a different context, of course. If you went through the refugee lessons then we talk about this, but in a bit of a different context. Well, here in a Canadian context, what are they referring to? Are there limits on this at all? That's what we'll talk about in this slide here. So we could see, of course, that the freedom granted to people under the Canadian Charter is the freedom to live their life without interference from the government in, of course, all of these aspects. But the big question is, are there limits to these freedoms? Can people simply do whatever they want, no matter what? The answer is no, they cannot do whatever they want, whenever they want. There are limits to these freedoms. Now, there's two great examples given on the link below where they talk about prisoners. So prisoners have some of their rights taken away because, of course, some of their freedoms and rights because they have broken the law. So that's the punishment that they have. So even though they are in Canada, they are covered by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but they broke the law, so they have some of those rights removed. If you're thinking of some of those rights, of course, let's say freedom of movement, where a person can live in different places in Canada. Well, a prisoner is obviously detained and does not have that right, or that right or freedom has been taken away. There's a great example over here that they gave. Now, if you're from Vancouver, I know you're going to know what this picture is. It's the hockey riots from quite a few years ago now. So it's funny, somebody told me that a little while ago. They said, oh, Canadians are so friendly until you start talking about hockey. And I guess that was an example of this. So they give a great example over here too that I think, again, gives us a little bit of a review of this topic. So they talk about people who gathered after a hockey game. So it was Vancouver. I remember the game was Vancouver against Boston. And of course, that freedom to assemble peacefully is protected under, of course, the Charter. Okay, and then they talk about the freedom of association as well, because there's other hockey fans. But when does this turn into a problem, and what's the limit on this? Well, you could see it in the next sentence. So the assembly turned into a riot, and the freedoms of others, such as shopkeepers whose windows were broken, some people got assaulted as well if they're wearing a different type of jersey, I remember seeing as well. So anyways, when that type of thing happens, so you can see underlined right in the middle, a freedom is a right to live your life without interference from the government unless you impinge on the freedoms of others. So in that case, those people were impinging on the freedoms of others. So the police had to arrest some of the rioters, and they were charged with breaking the law. And the final sentence, I think, gives us a perfect overview of this. Freedoms are guaranteed only to such reasonable limits as can be justified in a free and democratic society. Okay, so two big questions here to take a quick look at. Is this one here, who does the Charter protect and what rights are protected? And of course, what's the relationship between the Charter and other Canadian laws? So for the first one, the answer is pretty straightforward. It protects everybody. So everybody in Canada has the rights and freedoms afforded to them of the Canadian Charter, regardless of if the person is a citizen or a PR or a TR or even, I guess, even illegally in Canada. They have, of course, all those rights and freedoms. There are a couple little limitations. For example, Canadian citizens are the only people who are able to vote. We'll see this later on. And other little tiny areas, but generally speaking, everyone has access to this. This is reflected very clearly in the Singh case. And if you haven't read through that, it's a great idea to make sure that you incorporate this into your studies. Okay, so how does the Charter work with other Canadian laws? Well, the Charter is the supreme law of Canada, so it's part of the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada. The Charter is part of the Constitution. So when provinces or organizations want to make laws, they have to abide, of course, by the Charter. Now, are there limitations to the rights and freedoms given by the Charter? The answer is, of course, yes. We saw in the previous slide some of the limitations on freedoms. We saw that if a person is using their freedom afforded under the Canadian Charter to negate the freedom of someone else, well, then, of course, the person can be arrested and that type of thing. With rights as well, the freedom is not, of course, absolute. If a person wants to spread hate propaganda, for example, that is not covered by the freedom of expression. Okay, so as we dig into rights, so I think we have a good idea of Canadian freedoms afforded to Canadians and everyone really under the Canadian Charter, everyone in Canada, I should say. Well, what about rights? So remember we said that rights are legal, moral, social expectations that Canadians are entitled to from the government. So it's what do you expect from the government? What are your rights in terms of what the Canadian government owes you? And you can see over here, we've got section 3. So this is a little bit of a difference. Now we're going to take a look at this as it relates, of course, to immigration. And we could see that Canadian citizens have certain rights that PRs don't and TRs don't. And of course, voting, running for public office, and this type of thing. These are some of those rights that citizens have that, of course, permanent residents simply do not. Okay, this is an interesting one as well. So when we're thinking of mobility rights, we know that in terms of provincial immigration, there are certain standards, and you might think that mobility rights goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and really infringes upon a person's rights once they're in Canada. And of course, a PR certainly has mobility rights as well. The difference, though, is when we take a look at intent with PRs in terms of provinces. So we had a whole lesson on that. I think it was about an hour long. And I think you've got a good idea about that whole topic now. Well, the big thing to take a look at there is what was the person's intent when they arrived in Canada or when they applied to come to that certain province. If, of course, the person did not intend to truly live in that province, well, that's misrepresentation. If the person came to that province, had let's say the company he works for transferred him to another city, but the person fully intended to live in that province, well, of course, that person's covered under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 3, because he or she has mobility rights. All right, so the Charter, and we're going to see this more and more throughout all the lessons, that the Charter really is reflected in all the procedures in Canada's immigration, in, of course, the law of Canada as well. And this relates to other areas too. So we're looking at LMIAs, for example, if you're looking at a person who maybe their application was rejected and the officer outlines the reasons why. Why do they do that? The officer, I'm sure, is very busy and doesn't really have time to do that kind of stuff. So why would they do that? Is he just being polite? No, it's because, of course, the Charter guarantees procedural fairness. And this goes across the whole spectrum, right? So it's not only in criminal court, it's also, of course, in Canada's immigration system. These are offices that fall under Canada's jurisdiction. So we're going to see some examples of these areas later on. But of course, we're looking at section 7 through 14. It talks about the legal rights of a person. And if you want to pause the video to read through these, that's great. You'll see that they link really well with tribunals, with CBSA powers, with different procedures as they're related to immigration. So let's look at this through a quick little example. CBSA officers, what can they do? What can't they do? So can a CBSA officer take a look at anyone they want and search that person, seize any items as he or she sees fit? What do you think the answer is? Now, the answer is no. And why not? Well, if you take a look at Article 139.1, the officer certainly can search people who are seeking to come into Canada. They can, of course, take a look at their luggage, their personal effects, their transportation, so their car, anything like that, right? But only if the officer believes on reasonable grounds that the person, and then there's all these other areas, right? So for example, one example is maybe the person hasn't revealed their identity, or their documents are not organized properly, or the officer is suspicious about something else. But why would the officer not have this power to just take a look at anyone he wants or she wants and search that person? It might be useful to them. Well, the reason why, as we've just seen, is that it would violate the charter rights of the person who is being searched. So the officer has to believe on reasonable grounds that the person is doing something illegal or has something suspicious, I guess, in order to search the person. He can't just search someone based on no reason at all. And of course, judicial reviews, appeals, they're also related to the Charter. So again, if there is some sort of, I call it a mistake, I guess, if something happens in the administration of Canada's immigration laws that goes against the Charter, that goes against the laws themselves, that goes against the facts presented in the case, well, the person has the right to a judicial review or perhaps even an appeal. Now, why would the government want to do this? Well, again, it relates to the Charter, it relates to people's rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedom. All right, so take a look at the links over here if you feel like you want to dig more into this topic. And of course, you're going to see some interesting elements in here. I like the third one quite a bit. I think that might be a good idea for you to read through that. They're charter cases. So remember, we always say that it's a great idea for you to read through as many court cases as possible because it takes all of these elements of immigration and ties them into real life context that you also tie, of course, with various laws that we're looking at. So everything else on here is pretty interesting as well. And like I said, I mean, this is just a quick little lesson just to give you a review on the Canadian Charter as it relates to immigration. All right, good work, everybody. So this was I think this might have been our quickest lesson ever. So that's great. It was just I would say, a 17-minute lesson. And again, just to give you a little review of the Canadian Charter as it relates again to immigration. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I hope you see the Canadian Charter in a bit of a different context. And of course, I hope you can demonstrate this knowledge on your upcoming exam.